It was an unusually cold morning in New York City. The streets buzzed with hurried footsteps and distant honks, yet in the heart of Manhattan, amid the towering buildings and bright screens, walked a man whose life had quietly paused. David Turner, a 45-year-old financial consultant, was known in his world as a success story, a self-made man with everything money could buy. But no one saw what he carried inside, a silent grief since the loss of his wife 2 years ago in a car crash. Since then, life had become mechanical. Smile at meetings. Nod at dinner. Pretend at peace. On that morning, David sat on his usual bench in Bryant Park, sipping his coffee, eyes lost in the past. That's when he noticed her, a frail old woman, wrapped in a torn shawl, trying to feed pigeons with crumbs she had probably saved from the day before. Her hands trembled, and her shoes were mismatched. But her eyes were kind. She looked at David and smiled. "Good morning, sir," she said with a soft accent. "Possibly South Asian. Maybe Pakistani," he guessed. David nodded politely, expecting her to ask for money. She didn't. Instead, she sat at the far edge of the bench and continued feeding the birds. A few moments passed in silence until she turned to him. "You look like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time," she said gently. David blinked, surprised. He wasn't used to strangers reading him so easily. He sighed. "You could say that." She smiled again, warm but distant. "Sometimes, it helps to talk. Not because someone has the solution, but because the weight lightens a bit when it's shared." There was something unusually comforting about her presence. Maybe it was how unbothered she was by his status, or how her worn clothes did not take away from the dignity in her voice. "I lost someone," David said, his voice low. "And since then, everything feels hollow." She nodded knowingly. "Loss carves holes in our hearts. But sometimes, those holes are where the light gets in." Her words struck something in him. A truth he had avoided. For years, he had drowned himself in work, in silence, in avoidance. But this woman, this complete stranger, had seen him. As their conversation flowed, David learned her name was Nazia. She had come to America 3 decades ago with her husband, who had passed 10 years ago. Since then, she had been living in a tiny studio in Queens, surviving on meager government support and community donations. Yet, she never begged, never complained. "Allah ki rimat harmad par hodi hai," she said with faith in her eyes. David was stunned. "But, don't you ever feel angry? Lonely?" She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Loneliness is real, but kindness fills it. When I feed the birds, I feel like I'm still part of something living. When I speak kindly, it returns to me in some way. Always." Their talks became a routine. Every morning, David would find Nazia at the same bench. She shared stories of her youth in Lahore, her journey to America, her struggles, and the strangers who had shown her compassion along the way. David shared his heart too, the guilt of surviving the crash that killed his wife, the emptiness that followed, and how he had stopped believing in anything beyond numbers and control. One morning, Nazia didn't show up. Then another passed. Then 3. Worried, David asked the park security and nearby vendors if they had seen her. No one had. He searched online, called hospitals, even visited shelters. Finally, a volunteer at a food bank in Queens mentioned her. She had collapsed 3 days ago from pneumonia and was taken to a public hospital. David rushed to the hospital and found her unconscious, her body fragile, a tube running from her nose. He sat by her bed, holding her wrinkled hand, whispering, "You were the only light I'd seen in years. Please don't go." She opened her eyes slowly and smiled faintly. "So much Reham. In your heart now," she whispered. David stayed by her side throughout her recovery. He paid for her care, moved her into a better place, and even helped connect her with an old friend she hadn't seen in years. His transformation was not loud, but profound. He started a small initiative, the Kind Bench, dedicated to creating safe park spaces where volunteers simply listened, no therapy, no agenda, just human connection. The idea spread like wildfire across cities. Years later, in an interview on national TV, when asked what sparked this movement, David simply said, "It all began with a woman who had nothing, but gave me everything, kindness, faith, and a second chance." The audience was silent. Then the interviewer asked, "Where is she now?" David smiled, a tear in his eye. "She passed away peacefully last year. But her impact lives on, in every bench where someone is heard." Her name was Nazia. And she taught me that the smallest act of Reham, compassion, can change someone's entire life.